single question can echo in the vast empty spaces of a man's heart long after it has been asked, a whisper that threatens to tear down walls he spent a lifetime building. For a lonely rancher, walled in by grief and dust, that question came from a place he never expected, carried on the voice of a disabled, homeless girl, simply asking for what he was about to throw away. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the hardpan soil in hues of rust and bruised purple. Elias watched it from his porch, the ritual a bitter communion with the end of another day, identical to the one before. The land was his penance, a sprawling, unforgiving expanse of cracked earth and stubborn sagebrush that mirrored the geography of his own soul. He had inherited it, but he had earned its emptiness. The wind, a constant, lonely conversationalist, stirred the dust on the railing, the same dust that coated the photographs on his mantelpiece, their silver frames tarnished, and their smiles muted by a fine gray film. He had stopped cleaning them years ago. What was the point of polishing a memory? Inside, the remnants of his solitary meal cooled on a plate, half a steak, a mound of potatoes. It was more than he could eat, a habit of cooking for two that refused to die, a ghost in the kitchen. He rose, the scrape of his chair a harsh sound in the immense quiet, and picked up the plate. The trash bin waited by the back door, a final, unceremonious resting place. But as he stepped outside, into the encroaching twilight, a shape detached itself from the shadows of the ancient skeletal oak tree that marked the edge of his property. It was a girl, small and thin, her form made uncertain by the fading light. She moved with a subtle, rhythmic hesitation, a limp that seemed to pull her back with every step forward. He froze, his hand tightening on the plate. Strangers were not a feature of this landscape. They were an error, a disruption to the sterile order of his grief. She stopped a respectful distance away, her face obscured, and for a long moment, the only sound was the ever-present wind. Then, her voice, quiet but clear, cut through it. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" Elias stared, the plate in his hand suddenly heavy, an accusation. The question hung in the air between them, simple, direct, and utterly devastating in its humility. His first instinct was a spike of pure irritation, a reflexive defense against the intrusion. This was his land, his isolation. It was not a sanctuary for vagrants. He had worked for this silence, paid for it with everything he had. The words to send her away, sharp and cold, formed on his tongue. "Get off my property, go on now." But they caught in his throat, tangled in an image that flashed behind his eyes, another small hand, reaching for his, long ago. He looked from the plate to the girl, a silhouette of want against the dying sky. He saw the worn-out canvas of her shoes, the thinness of her jacket, wholly inadequate for the chill that descended upon the plains the moment the sun disappeared. There was no guile in her stance, no threat. There was only a quiet, desperate stillness. He said nothing. He couldn't trust his voice. Instead, he took 3 stiff steps forward and thrust the plate toward her. The gesture was graceless, almost an act of aggression, a dismissal. "Take it and go." She took the plate with 2 hands, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. They were cold. He pulled his hand back as if burned. He watched, a sentinel of stone on his own porch, as she retreated to the shadow of the oak tree and sat on the hard ground. She ate with a slow, deliberate grace that unnerved him, a stark contrast to the hunger he knew must be gnawing at her. Each bite was measured, savored. It wasn't the desperate gulping of an animal. It was the careful consumption of a person clinging to a sliver of dignity. He felt a profound and unwelcome shame. He was throwing this away. To him, it was garbage. To her, it was a reprieve. He remained there, rooted to the spot, until she had cleaned the plate. She didn't scrape it. She wiped it clean with a piece of bread he hadn't even noticed was there. When she was finished, she stood, walked back to the edge of the porch, and set the ceramic plate down gently, a silent offering of gratitude. Then, without another word, she turned and limped back into the deepening darkness, disappearing as quietly as she had arrived. He was alone again, but the silence was different now. It was heavier. It was filled with the echo of her question. The next morning, the plate sat on the porch railing, glinting in the sharp, early light. He picked it up and ran a thumb over the clean surface, the ghost of her touch still lingering. The trip into town was a necessary evil he endured once a week, a journey into a world of veiled glances and conversations that stopped the moment he pushed open the door to the general store. Today, the feeling was more acute. He felt like a man with a secret, though he couldn't have articulated what it was. Henderson, the proprietor, a man whose friendliness was as thin as his hair, offered a practiced smile. Elias, rough wind last night. It wasn't a question, it was a probe. Elias just nodded, grabbing a sack of flour. He moved through the aisles with grim efficiency, aware of the other patrons, Mrs. Gable and her 2 daughters, who fell silent and suddenly became intensely interested in a display of canned peaches. He could feel their judgment, a familiar weight on his shoulders. They saw a man who had failed, a man who had locked himself away after the tragedy, letting his fields go fallow and his heart with them. They didn't know the half of it. At the counter, Sheriff Brody was nursing a coffee, his bulk filling the space. Brody was a man who dealt in certainties, and Elias was an unwelcome variable. "Here you had a visitor," Brody said, not looking at him, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cup. The words were casual, but they landed like stones. "News traveled on the wind out here. Just a drifter," Elias mumbled, counting out his cash. "Happens." Brody finally turned his head, his eyes small and hard. "This one's different. A colored girl. Limps. Folks are concerned." The word hung there, ripe with unspoken meaning. Concerned about what? A girl with nothing, a girl who asked for scraps? "She's gone," Elias lied, the word tasting like ash. He didn't know if it was true, but he said it with a finality that was meant to end the conversation. Brody held his gaze a moment longer. "See that she stays that way. This is a quiet community. We like to keep it quiet." It was a threat wrapped in the guise of neighborly advice. Elias grabbed his supplies and left without another word, the bell on the door sounding a hollow, tinny farewell. Driving back down the long dirt road to his ranch, the anger was a hot knot in his stomach. It wasn't just anger at Brody or the town. It was anger at the girl for showing up, for dragging the world's ugliness to his doorstep. He had built these walls to keep the world out, but she had slipped through a crack, and now the world was pressing in, reminding him that he was still a part of it, whether he liked it or not. The quiet he was returning to no longer felt like peace. It felt like a cage. He expected the ranch to be empty, returned to its state of suspended grief. He wanted it to be, but as his truck rumbled past the dilapidated outbuildings, he saw her. She had taken shelter in the old collapsed barn, a structure he'd let rot for a decade, its spine broken by a winter storm long ago. She was sitting just inside the sliver of shade offered by a half-standing wall, trying to rewrap a makeshift bandage on her ankle, a piece of torn cloth, gray with dirt. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He got out of the truck, the dust puffing up around his boots, and walked toward her. His mind was set, the words from the sheriff echoing in his ears. He had to tell her to leave, for her own good, for his. He stopped 10 feet away. She looked up, her eyes wide, like a startled deer. They were dark, deep-set, and held a weariness that seemed far too old for her face. He opened his mouth, the harsh, necessary words ready. "You can't stay here." But what came out was a dry, rasping sound. He cleared his throat. "That needs a real bandage." Her eyes flickered down to her ankle, then back to his face. She said nothing. Her silence was a fortress, more imposing than his own. It wasn't defiance. It was a profound and complete exhaustion with the world. He saw it then. She wasn't just passing through. This was not a stop on a longer journey. This was the end of the line. "There's a well pump behind the house," he said, his voice rough. "Water's clean." He turned before she could respond, before he could say anything else that would betray the strange, churning conflict in his gut. He walked back to the house, feeling her eyes on his back. Inside, he unpacked his supplies with unsteady hands, setting a can of beans on the counter with more force than necessary. He looked out the kitchen window, which faced away from the barn. He didn't want to see her. He didn't want to think about her. But the image of her was burned into his mind. The thinness of her arms, the careful way she tended to her wound, the silent, bottomless exhaustion in her gaze. He had gone out there to be cruel, to be practical. He had gone out there to sever the thread that had connected them the night before. But instead, he had only strengthened it, adding a new strand of shared, unspoken acknowledgement. He had given her permission to exist on his land, and he had no idea why. That night, sleep offered no escape. It dragged him back, as it always did, to the day the silence began. The memory came in fragments, sharp and brutal. The sun, hot and unforgiving, just like today. The scent of freshly cut hay and the sweet, cloying smell of motor oil. A laugh high and bright like wind chimes. "Higher, Daddy. Push me higher." He was in the barn, the real barn, before it was a ruin. He was fixing the tractor, his hands black with grease. Sarah, his daughter, was on the rope swing he had hung from the main rafter. She was 7. Her hair was the color of wheat, her eyes the same brilliant blue as her mother's. Higher. He was tired. The harvest had been long, and the bank was breathing down his neck. He was distracted, his mind on numbers, on rainfall, on the failing engine of the machine that was supposed to be his salvation. He looked over, a strained smile on his face. "That's high enough, sweet pea. Come on down." But she pumped her little legs, soaring higher, her laughter echoing in the cavernous space. Just one more, a real high one. He sighed, annoyed, and gave the rope a perfunctory, powerful shove, harder than he meant to. He turned back to the tractor, his mind already on the faulty spark plug. The next sound was not laughter. It was a snap, a sound like a dry branch breaking underfoot, followed by a different sound, a sickening thud that vibrated through the wooden floorboards and up into his bones. He turned, his heart seizing in his chest. The rope, frayed from years of use, had given way. Sarah was on the ground, a small broken pile at a horribly unnatural angle. He ran, but it felt like moving through water. He saw her face, the surprise in her wide-open eyes, the small trickle of blood from her temple. He saw her leg, twisted beneath her. He remembered the silence that followed, a silence so total, so absolute. It consumed all the air in the world. Elias awoke with a gasp, his sheets soaked in sweat. He sat up in the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked out the window toward the collapsed barn. In his mind, he saw the girl from yesterday, her rhythmic limp, the way she favored her leg. The same leg. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But the guilt, a monster that slept at the foot of his bed, was wide awake now. It whispered to him in the dark, telling him that nothing was a coincidence. It told him that the past was not dead. It wasn't even past. It was sitting out there in his barn, waiting. A week passed. A strange, silent routine established itself between the house and the ruined barn. Each evening, Elias would leave a plate of food on the stump of the old oak tree. He never waited to see her collect it. He would leave it, turn his back, and walk inside. In the morning, the plate would be back on his porch, clean. He told himself it was practical. A stray animal would just get the food if he threw it out. It was a way to dispose of the extra portions his hands still insisted on making. It was anything but what it was. A conversation. It was an acknowledgement. It was a bond. He learned her name, though he never asked for it. One afternoon, while mending a fence line near the barn, he heard her humming. It was a low, mournful, beautiful sound. Later, while fetching a tool from his truck, he saw that she had found a discarded piece of wood and was carving it with a shard of glass. He saw the name take shape under her patient hands. Ilara. The name felt foreign and ancient. He never spoke it aloud. One morning, the clean plate on his porch was not alone. Beside it lay a horse harness, one he had thrown on the scrap pile weeks ago. The leather had been split, the stitching rotten. Now, it was repaired. The split was stitched together with what looked like waxed thread, the needlework impossibly small and neat. The leather was clean, conditioned with something that made it supple again. He picked it up, stunned. It was a gesture he didn't know how to receive. It was a payment. It was a gift. It was a message that said, "I am not just a taker. I have worth." He took the harness into his own workshop, a place that had been dormant for years, a museum of his failure. He ran his calloused fingers over the precise stitches. He had not been able to fix his tractor. He had not been able to fix his daughter. He had not been able to fix his life. But this girl, with nothing but a shard of glass and some salvaged thread, had fixed this broken thing. He hung the harness on a hook, where it looked strangely alive among the dusty, rusted tools. The act felt significant, a crack in the mausoleum he had built around himself. For the first time in a decade, a new object had been added to the room. It was terrifying. It felt like a betrayal of his grief, a violation of the sacred stasis he had so carefully maintained. It felt impossibly like hope. The black car kicking up dust on his road was an omen. It wasn't the sheriff's truck. It was too clean, too self-important. Rolled to a stop in front of his house, and Pastor Fuller emerged, his suit as black as the car, a stark funereal presence against the brown landscape. Fuller was the town's moral arbiter, a man whose piety was a weapon he wielded with practiced ease. Elias met him on the porch, his body forming a natural barricade in front of the door. "Elias," the pastor began, his smile not reaching his eyes. "A beautiful, if lonely corner of God's country you have here." Elias didn't return the pleasantry. "What do you want, Pastor?" Fuller's smile tightened. "I come as a friend, as a shepherd to his flock, even the lost sheep." His gaze drifted pointedly toward the collapsed barn. "The town is worried, my son. They see a good man, a man wrestling with his own demons, perhaps making a compassionate but misguided choice. They speak of a young woman of ill repute you are harboring." The words were coated in honey but stung like hornets. Ill repute. Because she was homeless? Because she was black? Because she was a mirror to their own lack of charity? "She's not being harbored," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "She's just here." "Here?" the pastor repeated, feigning confusion. "On your land? A child of God, surely, but one who belongs with her own people, in a place with proper facilities. We have charities for that, institutions, to encourage her to stay here, in these conditions. It is not Christian, Elias. It is cruel. It exposes her to danger. It exposes you to temptation." The insinuation was vile, a poison dart aimed at the most vulnerable part of him. Elias felt a rage so pure and cold it almost choked him. He thought of the neatly stitched harness. He thought of her quiet humming. He thought of the plate, returned clean every morning. "You know nothing about cruelty, Pastor," Elias said, the words coming out like chips of ice. "And you know nothing about God's country. Now get off my land." For a moment, Pastor Fuller looked genuinely shocked, the mask of pious concern slipping to reveal the hard face of a bully who had been challenged. He straightened his tie, his expression curdling into one of pitying condescension. "I will pray for you, Elias. I will pray that you see the light before it is too late." He turned and got back in his car, leaving a cloud of judgment and dust in his wake. Elias stood there long after the car was gone, his hands clenched into fists. He had defended her. He had drawn a line in the dirt, the town against him and the girl in the barn. It was a battle he had not chosen, but now he was in it. The sky had been threatening for days, a bruised, oppressive ceiling of gray. That night, it finally broke. The rain didn't fall. It assaulted the earth. It came down in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the dirt yard into a churning sea of mud. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very foundations of the old house. Elias stood at the kitchen window, watching the deluge, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. Every clap of thunder felt like a judgment. He thought of the collapsed barn, its roof more hole than cover. He pictured Alara huddled in a corner, the wind and rain lashing at her through the skeletal walls. The image was a physical pain in his chest. "It's not your problem," the old, bitter part of him snarled. "You told the pastor to leave. You did your part." But the lie was thin and weak against the storm's fury. He thought of the harness. He thought of her name, carved into wood. He thought of the way she limped, a constant, quiet reminder of his own past. He couldn't leave her out there. Not in this. Cursing himself, his weakness, his foolishness, he pulled on his heaviest coat, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and plunged into the tempest. The wind tore at him, and the rain was blinding. He slipped and slid through the mud, the beam of his flashlight cutting a frantic, dancing path through the chaos. He reached the barn, shouting her name over the roar of the storm. "Ilara!" He found her in the driest corner, but she was soaked through, shivering uncontrollably. When he shone the light on her face, he saw her eyes were glazed with fever. Her skin was hot to the touch. The storm had broken her. He didn't think. He acted. He scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her through the gale back toward the house. He kicked open the door and brought her inside, crossing a threshold he had not allowed another living soul to cross in 10 years. He laid her on the old sofa by the hearth, the one his wife had loved. He stripped off her wet, thin jacket and covered her with a thick wool blanket, then built a fire, his hands working with a purpose they hadn't felt in a decade. As the warmth began to seep into her, she started to murmur, her words a fevered, disjointed slurry. "He's coming. Said he'd find me. Uncle Jed. Said I owed him." Her eyes fluttered open for a second, unfocused, and she looked at Elias, but he knew she wasn't seeing him. "He said I'm his property." The word landed in the quiet room, more powerful than the thunder outside. Property. It was the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. She wasn't just homeless. She was a fugitive. And the storm she was running from was far more dangerous than the one raging outside his windows. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. Ilara's fever broke with the dawn. Elias had sat up all night by the fire, watching her, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, a sentinel against the ghosts in the room. When she woke, she was lucid, but a deep fear settled in her eyes when she realized where she was. In his house. Vulnerable. "The storm," he said, his voice hoarse. "You were sick." She tried to sit up, her movements stiff and weak. "I have to go." "No," he said, the word more firm than he intended. "You're not well. You'll eat something. You'll rest." He didn't know how to play the host, the caregiver. He made oatmeal, thick and lumpy, and brought it to her with a glass of water. They existed in a tense, fragile silence, the space between them filled with everything unsaid. It was mid-afternoon when the pickup truck appeared, crawling down the road like a predator. It was old and battered, a different kind of threat from the pastor's clean car. A large, heavy-set man with a florid face and mean little eyes got out. He walked right up to the porch as if he owned it. Elias met him at the door. "I'm looking for my niece," the man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Ilara. Little thing. Worthless leg. Run off on me. Heard she might have come this way." He peered past Elias, trying to get a look inside the house. "She's property of her family. I'm Jed," the name from the fever dream, the man she was running from. Elias felt a cold dread, but also a strange clarity. The memory of his own failure, his own inaction, rose up in him not as guilt but as fuel. He had stood by once and let something terrible happen. He would not do it again. "Push me higher, Daddy." The echo was a command. "There's no one here by that name," Elias said, his voice flat and even. He positioned his body, filling the doorway completely. Jed's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me, old man. I know she's here. That's my blood, my responsibility. She owes me." He took a step forward, his hand raising as if to push past. In that instant, Elias saw it all again. The frayed rope, the fall, the silence. The moment he could have acted but didn't. The moment he could have checked the rope, could have said no, could have paid more attention. This was that moment again, given back to him by a cruel and benevolent fate. "You'll take another step," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than a shout. "And you'll find out what responsibility really looks like on this land." Jed hesitated, his brutish confidence wavering in the face of Elias's absolute stillness. He was a man accustomed to bullying and bluster, to people who flinched. Elias did not flinch. He was a mountain of quiet, immovable resolve. He was a man with nothing left to lose, who had just discovered something he was not willing to let go of. "She's a child," Jed spat, trying a different tactic, one of indignation. "She's family. You have no right." Elias's gaze was unwavering. "And you have no right on my property." The simple statement was an unbreakable wall. For a long, tense moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. The only sounds were the drip of water from the eaves and the distant cry of a hawk. Jed searched Elias's face for a crack, a weakness, and found none. He found only the dead-end finality of a gravestone. He had misjudged the old man. He had seen a broken-down recluse, not a guardian at the gate of his own redemption. With a final venomous glare, Jed grunted, a sound of frustrated defeat. He turned, stomped back to his rusted truck and wrenched the door open. He spun his tires in the mud as he left, scarring the earth in a final, impotent display of aggression. Elias watched until the truck was a speck on the horizon, until the sound of its engine was swallowed by the immense silence of the plains. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the tension draining out of him, leaving a profound and aching emptiness in its place. He turned and walked back into the house. Ilara was standing by the fireplace, her hands clutching the wool blanket around her like armor. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She had heard everything. For the first time, she spoke to him in a full sentence, her voice barely a whisper. Why? He looked at her, at the small, resilient girl who had mended his harness, who had survived the storm, who had asked him for nothing but the scraps from his table. He didn't have the words to explain the long, tangled history of his grief and guilt, of a frayed rope and a daughter's laugh. So he gave her the only truth that mattered now. I owed a debt, he said. The words were for him as much as for her. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or heavy, it was a space being cleared, a foundation being laid. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, and a single ray of light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, brilliant possibility.